My name's Ashley Grant. I am on the Aurelia JavaScript framework team, which is hilarious since I'm about to give a talk about JavaScript without Webpack, Transpilers, or frameworks. But that's okay. You know, what we're going to talk about today is the power of modern JavaScript, but more importantly, the power of the modern browser. Who here does front-end development? I'm guessing most of you. Yeah, you use Webpack or some other bundling tool, maybe Require.js. You choose either Babel or TypeScript for transpiling everything so that it can run on as many browsers as possible, right? I'm going to show you that that's not as necessary as you might think here in 2018. And then I'm going to show you at the end that even for those poor souls who still have to support IE 10, you might actually be able to get away with some of this, okay? Now I want to preface everything I'm going to show you by saying that frameworks and Webpack, they are very valuable tools, but what you should end up with at the end of this talk is realizing, especially with transpilers, that a lot of the stuff you're transpiling, you probably don't need to transpile anymore. And then a lot of the stuff that you might end up pulling out a framework for to build some small little one-off app at work, you might be able to just do directly in the browser and it not take nearly as long because you don't have to figure out how to get Webpack to work for the 400th time. So yeah, by the end of this, that's going to be all of you, or at least that's my hope. And for the sexier ones, that'll be you. So yeah, but seriously, let's get to the code. So I've got our favorite JavaScript library here I'm using right now for this application. I'm using jQuery to build an application. Let's all go back to 2012, and we're using jQuery to build our applications. Now, let me see if I am running it. I am. So if I go over here in Chrome, I've got this application. If you've ever been to one of my Aurelia intro talks, this should look really familiar because I lack imagination when it comes to designing UIs, so I just reused the application that I have. This was an Aurelia application, and I stripped everything out and did it myself. So, you know, as I type, it will update my name there. That's probably a little hard to see. You know, so if I say foo, it'll change that. If I click here, it'll say my name, and if I go over here, I've got this page, and if the conference Wi-Fi is actually working, which it doesn't seem to be, it will display GitHub users. So let's check that real quick. Oops, I broke everything. This is awesome because I'm using Bootstrap. Oh, my internet broke. Hold on a second. Yep, so let me do that. Does anybody know of a site that's not HTTP that I could go to real quick to pull up? Because like if you just go to news.google.com, oh, there we go. Nobody knows what I'm talking about, where like you get stuck trying to get to this site, but it can only override HTTP, but the web is so moving to HTTPS, and you're like, I can't remember a site. So, all right, so we are good. Let's hit refresh, and if I come over here to the GitHub users, you'll see here, this shows a list of GitHub users, and this hits the GitHub API, and then it pulls down their images and everything. Let's give this application a very quick once-over. I have an index.html file in here with a whole bunch of Bootstrap. So most of this can be ignored. Then I have these two tabs that have some HTML5 stuff here for like the name of the link and everything. So I have a welcome page and a users page. And then I have divs for each of my pages. So I have the welcome page here and then my users page here. Nothing crazy, but we've all built applications like this, and we probably were like, man, I wish I had handlebars. So I didn't want to bring in any libraries other than jQuery when I built this application, so I did it all by hand. Now I come over into my, well, first, I load our application using Require.js. So first I had to go get Require.js. And then I have to set up a config file for require.js, load the config file. Once that's loaded, I tell require.js to load the main JavaScript file for my application. If you were building an application in 2012, you probably did something like this. Unless you were me, in which case I just left everything unbundled and was a terrible developer. So if we go into my main.js file, we'll see that, for example, at the top here, we have a define function that gets called. That's part of require.js. I'm defining a module. I pass in an array with strings for dependent or module dependencies. So I need jQuery. I need the welcome page, the users page. Those all get passed into this function. And then require.js will call this function, which has, inside of it, has some init page, show page, and then I just run the application by calling the init page function. But I just want to stop for a second and notice all of the rigmarole I have to go through just so that I'm not polluting the global namespace. You know, require.js requires me to call a function to create a module, and it does that because it's necessary. Like that var pages, if I wasn't inside of this function's definition, pages would be a variable everywhere in my JavaScript application. Because JavaScript, before 2015, everything was global unless it was inside of a function. And that led to stuff, we've all heard of IFIs, immediately invoked function expressions. And who here looked at an IFI and said, why do I have to do this? Why couldn't Brendan Eich have just designed it correctly the first time? So ask him that on Twitter, see what happens. But anyways, this is a basic JavaScript application. When I go over, for example, on the users, I have this template here that has some strings inside of it that I'm going to search for and replace with the URL for the user, their name, the link you can click on. Down here, I've got a HTTP client that I wrote, which wraps jQuery's AJAX function here, or getJSON. If we go down and look at that, you'll see here it says getJSON, and I just call $getJSON, and when that returns, or when it is successful, it'll call the callback function that I pass in. You know, and this is all perfectly acceptable code. But there's problems with it. Like, what if I wanted to go out, hit an API, and then once that API returns me data, I want to do some calculations on that, and then based on what I've done then, I might want to call another API. I'm going to quickly get into something called callback hell, where I'm going to be doing a whole lot of scrolling this way, you know, because 500 lines wide of code. So there's been fixes for a lot of this. So let's get started migrating this application into modern JavaScript. And so the first thing I'm going to do is take my jQuery app and copy it into a new app called, I'm going to call it Modern JavaScript App. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a whole bunch of branches on a Git repo so that I don't screw any of this up, because there's a lot of steps here. Okay, so in this first step, I've just copied things over, and the first thing I want to do is look at fixing some issues with variables in JavaScript. As I said, the var keyword, everything gets hoisted up as high as it can go, which sometimes means the global namespace. And this is a problem. For example, if you're inside of a for loop and you declare a variable that happens to have the same name as a for loop somewhere else in your application, that gets hoisted all the way up, and you might get unexpected behavior because you somehow overwrite something, and you might have an if to check if that variable later on is undefined, but it's defined because you set it inside of a for loop, because you're a C# developer by trade and you think that things stay inside of their curly braces. But with the var keyword, they don't. So in ES 2015, the new version of JavaScript that came out a couple years ago, this was finally fixed by providing us with two new keywords, the const keyword and the let keyword. Who's familiar with const and let? Okay, good. I always have to ask to see how familiar people are, because Sometimes I give this talk and everybody's C# developers and they're afraid of JavaScript. Other times they're like, get on with it, I want to see the cool stuff. And I feel like I've got about 50-50 in here. So const and let replace var. Now const creates a constant value, which means you can't overwrite that value. Let creates a variable that's actually allowed to be variable. You can change the value of it. There is a little bit of a gotcha here though, which is that with JavaScript objects, you can set a const equal to some object, and then you can change properties on that object even though it's a const, because you're not changing the variable, you're changing stuff inside of it. But my recommendation for those of you who have not used const and let before is, first off, don't ever type var ever again in your JavaScript. Leave that over in C# world, okay? If you know about linting, set up your linting tool, whether ESLint or TSLint, to not even allow you to save the file with the var keyword in there, because those little persnickety bugs that will pop up from var are completely fixed with const and let, and that is because if you declare a variable using const or let inside of a block, it stays inside that block. So if you declare, for example, you have an old school for loop, like right here, and I have here this let I. Now that when that was a var, I got hoisted up to where that var HTML was. Now in this case it doesn't hurt me, but in a real application that has functions that get long, that could be a real problem, and also I is going to go down into functions that get called and stuff. But with let, it's going to stay just inside these curly braces. I is only going to be in there. Any questions about let versus const? It's like the least cool thing I'm going to be showing here. All right, so our next step is to really start showing off some of the new syntax in ES 2015. So first off, when we look in here now, I have, go down here. Now I've got everything here. I'm using let and const, okay? But I still have these functions. And I personally, I only do JavaScript development now, but I started out as a C# developer. So I'm comfortable with creating classes and interacting with classes. And so this whole idea of creating, like here, I want to create a user's object, but I have to return a function that you call that then returns an object. That's really goofy syntax for me. But thankfully in ES 2015, we got classes in JavaScript. And so I can actually come in here and replace this class here like this and do a constructor. And I'm not even going to type all of this because I'm just going to, oops. I'll just move to the next step and show you. So now, instead of returning a function, I get to return the actual class, and I have this constructor here. Now the one thing that changes is if we go over, for example, here in my show page function, if I go back to here, I just called that function so what I did here, I have up here I have an object that has the page names in it, and it has what are going to become classes, okay? And so I can call this array, and the function down here will be called based on the property name. Okay, not the array, the object. But when I switch over to using classes, now I need to new up that instance, okay? Now you could do this type of syntax in the older versions of JavaScript, but the way I wrote my code, it didn't do that. So if we go back over here, we see now I have to do new next page class. Also, I just want to say that this is a cool feature of JavaScript here. I probably couldn't write this in C#, like without a little bit of weirdness, but like I just have a property on an object that is the class itself, not an instance of the class, but the actual class, and then I can new that up here. I find that pretty cool. But the coolest part here is that now I'm just returning a class from my module to require.js. So when require.js says, oh, somebody has a dependency on the users module, they're going to get back, it's going to call this function, and then the thing that's returned is the class. And so over in main.js, where I depend on it, that's the class. And so now I can actually use that class. This is a little bit of syntactic sugar that came with ES 2015. But for me personally, it's something I really like. Now, there are a lot of people in JavaScript world who hate this. And if you hate that, that's fine. Don't use it. But I like it, so I use it. Now, through this, I've gotten rid of the var keyword. So I've gotten rid of any crazy issues that come from variable hoisting, where things get moved out of where I expect them to be. I've gotten rid of those returning a function from my module that really was a class, and now I'm actually returning classes, but I'm still using jQuery all over the place. Like right here, I need to go and set up a click event on all of the anchor or the links inside of nav UL, and I want to grab that event and then pull out some data from it, and then based on that I'm going to call show page to actually show that specific page. And this is the stuff that even today, when I talk to developers who know all about ES 2015, maybe they use a framework or React or something, Angular, React, even I get this a lot answering Stack Overflow questions about Aurelia. There are people who think that this is the only way to do this stuff because in the browsers, the only way I can access a specific element is to do like document.getElement by ID. And jQuery allows me to do these CSS style selectors, and that's way better. So that's why I have to have, the hundreds of kilobytes for jQuery. And you're wrong. So what I'm going to do now, come back over here, and I have switched this to use a function called querySelectorAll. Now what querySelectorAll is a built-in function that's been built in since Internet Explorer 9. So for the people in the room who still have to support Internet Explorer 9 and you're thinking, all this stuff, there's no way it's going to run natively in my browser, some of this stuff will run natively in your browser. And querySelectorAll is one of those. Basically, the web community looked at jQuery and they said, that's awesome, I want that thing built into my browser. Now, I do get a lot of complaints from people who say, yeah, but jQuery was easy because it's just a $, and now I have to type out all that crap, and I don't want to. But here's the cool thing. You can just say const $ equals document.query selector all. Yeah. And then I do this. Boom, I've got jQuery. 0 kilobytes for jQuery. Now, I do want to mention, though, that jQuery does provide some nice things, especially when it comes to adding and removing events from things. The native APIs for adding and removing events, I think, are kind of terrible because you have to you call add event listener and you pass in a function that is the handler, but then you have to hold on to that exact instance of the function or that exact thing that you passed in if you want to ever remove that event handler. I wish it would just pass me a subscription object that I could then call maybe one of these days. I should get on the JavaScript committee and make that happen. But anyways, this is how you have to do it. And I will say that I prefer the jQuery way of doing this, but I don't prefer it enough to have all of those hundreds of kilobytes of data for jQuery. So what I've done now, as I said, I've gotten rid of all the places in my app that use jQuery for finding elements or for attaching events. If we go over to users, originally I was, well here, in users I have the element passed into me because what I do here, I switched over to using getElementById to find the next page element. You're still allowed to use getElementById. You could use query selector here and just put a hashtag or a pound sign and it'll do the same thing. The other thing I want to mention is in jQuery, you only had one option, which was to call the jQuery function and it would give you back either a collection or a single item if it found it. In the browser native environment, we use query selector all if we want to get more than one thing or if we think we might get more than one thing. And we just use query selector if we know we're only going to get one thing. Okay? If you use query selector and there's more than one thing that could be returned, you're only going to, I believe you're only going to get the first thing from it. Now, IDs are supposed to be globally unique on your page. So just use getElementById. Why not? Because then I don't have to type hashtag and pretend I'm tweeting inside my JavaScript. Okay. Now I want to go back to this whole getJSON function here, where I have to pass in a callback. There are real problems with callbacks that are more than just the thing I talked about earlier, which is they call it callback hell, where your code just goes off the side of the screen. Because like if I wanted to call getJSON again in here, maybe there's some JSON on one of these that I could call a URL and get it. I got to call getJSON, I got to pass in a new function and everything, and that sucks. But the real problem that I've found personally is that there's no real way to like hold on to a value of something here, or like I want to call getJSON and have it get the JSON object from that API, but then I just want to hold on to that JSON and have it available elsewhere for me to use from then on. And I mean, in here, yeah, I could just like set a global variable, or at least global, a class level variable, but then I got to make sure that that's been set. And has anybody had any type of problem like this? Because I have. Basically, you gotta check to see if that variable's been set, and if it hasn't, then you gotta go call getJSON, and then somehow get your code to be in now it's in a callback, and you're like, this is crazy. Well, in ES 2015, promises became built in, and promises are way better for doing asynchronous code, which is what callbacks are. It's asynchronous code. Now, the way that a promise works is instead of passing in a callback, you call a function which returns a promise, and at its most basic level, a promise is an object that has a function on it called then, which you pass a function into that the promise will call once whatever the first function was that created the promise. Once that thing finishes doing its stuff, it'll call then. Okay? Now that sounds like it's not a big deal because you've still got callbacks basically, and the only thing I have saved you is not having to scroll off the right side of the screen, right? And at a basic level, that's it. And if that's all we got from promises, they would probably still be worth it. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to convert this getJSON to using promises. And I'm also going to finish up getting rid of jQuery, because in my HTTP client, I still had to use $getJSON because it was a very friendly wrapper around calling out to some URL and that returns JSON, and it parses the JSON automatically for me and then just calls a callback. And that was really nice. But we now have a new API called Fetch. Is everybody familiar? Anybody not familiar with Fetch? The Fetch API? No? Everybody's familiar with Fetch? So fetch is a promise native API for making web call or making calls out to URLs. And here's the thing, fetch is built into all of the native browsers along with promises. So now instead of calling $.getJSON, I just call fetch, and then I say .then, and then I have a function in here, and the thing that gets passed in to .then when you call fetch is a response object, and one of the functions on that is a function called JSON, which will try to convert whatever the response was into, or try to parse it as JSON, and it will itself return a promise. Okay, so you can .then off of that, or if you return something that returns a promise when you're in the .then of another promise, you can just .then here, and it figures it all out for you. Okay, so you could keep going. But what I'm doing is I'm returning this promise here from inside of this other promise. And so now over in users, I just say get JSON. Did that not? That might be the wrong. Okay, I messed that up. So I was reworking stuff, but so we would have here .then like this. Okay, and so here I know that data is going to be the JSON. Okay, or sorry, it's going to be the actual parsed data. And so this works just like how jQuery's getJSON function used to work, except I didn't have to bring in a library to do this. This is built in. But, and I'm going to go off script here for just a second, and I want to mention that I was talking all about how promises are more than just, you know, keeping us from having to scroll. Here's the cool thing. So imagine that maybe here this JSON object is something like it's some lookup data. You know, and I want to hold on to that lookup data, but the APIs outside of me could call me repeatedly. And so here in HTTP client, you know, I want to be able to like check to see if that specific path has been requested before, and if it has, I'll just return the result from the last time. But I need to return a promise, right? Because they're expecting a promise to be returned. Well, here's the cool thing. I can come in here and I'm going to make this really simple. I'm just going to say my promise. I'm going to say null. I'm going to delete this. I'm going to check here if my promise return, or not, it'd be this dot my promise, return this dot my promise. Okay, else return this dot my promise equals this. And now I've held on to the result. So the result of this is going to be a promise that holds as its value the JSON. And so now I can just return that promise, okay? And really, because I always forget, I'm so used to writing TypeScript nowadays that I forget I don't have to declare properties on my class. I can just use them. Has anybody ever used promises in this type of fashion? A couple of you? When you first figured out that you could do this, did you not feel like a programming wizard? No? Okay, I did, because I used this type of setup to load the Google Maps API. Now, the Google Maps API, for those of you who don't know, you load that through a script tag that you have to write out, and so I wanted to dynamically load that script tag, but I wanted to have a nice little wrapper around it, so anywhere in my application where I needed the Google Maps API, I could call and get a promise back that would only resolve when the API was loaded. Well, and I don't have enough time, talk to me later and I'll show you, but basically what I did was, if you create a promise by hand, and you just new promise here, you pass in a couple of, you pass in the function that the promise is going to execute, and the way that you tell the promise you have finished executing is you call this resolve function, okay? And so what I did, when you create that script element for the Google Maps API, you pass in the name of a function that it will call as its callback when it's run. But that has to be on your global namespace, so window dot something. So what I did was, here I create a script tag and I put that, and then I just had window dot gmaps callback equals resolve. And so then, and I return this promise, but I also hold on to the promise. And so when the Google Maps goes and it needs to call something in the global namespace, it'll call gmaps callback, which calls resolve, which a completely different server is causing my promise to resolve, and then the API gets returned. This was the moment where I was like, holy crap, promises are crazy. Come talk to me after this talk and I'll show you the actual code and you'll just, because I didn't figure it out, someone showed me, and I was writing it in some crazy hard way where I was like just running a for loop to wait and check for it and everything, or a while, and call. Yeah, it wasn't smart the way I was doing things. Now, one of the things we'll see in here, if we go back over to this welcome screen, I haven't really shown you too much the welcome screen, but each of these pages that I've written, they have a function called activate. And the home page, or the main.js, will call, after it news up, it looks to see if activate exists, and if it does, it'll call the function. And so in welcome.js, I'm creating a whole bunch of event listeners. And one of the things I have to do is something we've all done as JavaScript developers, which is, and of course the highlight blocks it, is const me this, or this that equals this, right? We've all done that because this doesn't always mean what you expect it to mean in JavaScript because of two awesome, terrible functions called bind and apply, where you can set what this is going to be inside of the function when you call it. But that's a problem for me because right now, in main.js, when I call nextPage.activate, this is going to be what I expect it to be. But then in my event listeners that I've set up here for when I type in those text boxes, this update handler, which is, where did I put it? Right here, okay? This would actually be the event, the element that the event happened on in there. And that's a problem because I want to call a function on my own class instance and not on the element. So I have to do this whole const me equals this, and this is a real pain in the butt. Luckily, in ES 2015, we got a new feature that helps fix this. Anybody guess what the new feature is for those of us who write it? Arrow functions, yes. So I'm going to quickly close these. And now, if we come back to welcome, wait a second. Oh wait, sorry, I got ahead of myself. Let's talk about arrow functions in just a second. What I've actually done here, if you notice, is I've gotten rid of require.js here, okay? I've switched over to what are called native modules. Now, before you walked in this room, who thought you could use native modules in the browser today without something like Webpack? Did anybody know that you could do that? No? Well, let me show you something. My main.js here uses import statements. I'm importing modules. Okay, in users.js, I import the HTTP client, which is in a completely different folder. So I have to go up a folder, down a folder to grab it. Okay, here HTTP client doesn't have anything. And if you remember over here in, here I'll do this. So we all remember all of this code here that I had to write to get require.js up and running. Well, watch what happens when I switch back. It just becomes a single script tag. And the only thing that's different here is it says type equals module. And this is natively running in Chrome right now. If I hit refresh, my application is running. And for those of you who don't believe me, I go here. Actually, wait. You can not believe me for a second here. Let me disable cache. You know what I forgot to do is there we go. So you know it's my new application here because it's broken. And I'm not sure why. Do I have errors? I do. Next page class is not defined. This is what I get for not testing.
But it worked on my computer.
Well, it worked on my computer the last time I did this. But I can still show you, if we go back over here, and I'll get this working in just a second, but that script type equals module is there. And if we go look at main.js in my sources, first off, there's an error in main.js, right? And if we look here, I can come in here and let's debug this and see why it's not working. If you see here, I've got import statements. I'm going to press F5. Come in here. What did I break? So I have next page element. Okay. Next page class is, yeah, I know what I did. I forgot to, yeah, I was reworking some of this yesterday, and I screwed up my Git, and I deleted something. So probably every single one of these is going to be broken from here on out, but that's okay because I can fix it. So if I want to show, let me quickly go back and get the old version of the code. Here, I need to get this line of code. And then I know it starts working later because I was testing some later steps. So now, yes. So now here we are. As I said, everything is refreshed and it works. You see things work the same way they did before. And I'm using native modules in here. You don't need Webpack to use the import statement and export statements in JavaScript today. And for those of you who are like, okay, fine, that's Chrome. Does it work, I don't know, in Firefox? Well, let's go check. Here it is in Firefox. And if I go to my developer tools, where are we? Console, no, debugger. Right there. I know it's hard to see, but those are import statements. Right there. Okay? This works. All of the modern browsers, this works in. I'm not going to show it to you in Edge right now because there is a polyfill I have to add, but it's not for loading modules. It's actually for a property on elements that I use in here that doesn't, for some reason, doesn't exist in Edge. So if nothing else comes out of this talk today, you should know that now you can do this in Edge. All right, so I'm going to hold on to this. And now we will go back to the thing I was talking about a second ago, which is arrow functions. Okay, good. It showed back up in this commit. That's awesome. Okay, so now what I've done, as you remember, we were working with const me equals this. Well, now over here, I don't have to do that anymore. I can just say, I just start doing my code, because when I create my update handler function, I use this arrow function syntax here, sometimes called fat arrow functions. In C#, this looks just like a lambda function. And the cool thing with arrow functions is that this will be what they call like the lexical this. It's what this is what you expect it to be when this is called, when the function gets called. And so when I have my added event listener here, I just say this.update handler. It's going to call that. It's going to call it the same way it used to, where it tries to set this to be that element. But it doesn't matter, because this is going to be my class instance now. And this is native in the browser again. If I come back over here and I refresh, and we look at welcome.js, we see here that I'm using arrow functions natively in the browser. They don't have to be transpiled by TypeScript or Babel. They work natively today. Everything I'm showing you today works without any transpilers or frameworks. Okay, the next thing I want to look at is in users.js. Now in users.js, I'm using a for loop. I am not using a for in loop to loop over this array, the data array. And that's because the for in loop in JavaScript does not work like you expect it to if you are a C# developer and use for each loops, for each something in something. Because in JavaScript, when you write, if I was to write this code here to replace this for loop, if I were to say for, not const, let user in data, what JavaScript's actually going to do is iterate over all of the properties in data. So that's going to be all of the items in its array, but it's also going to be like the length property. And that's a problem, because we've all written for in loops and then we're like, why the heck doesn't this work? And then we're like, I have to write a C style for loop. Why does this is supposed to be the future, not C. This is not 1970. What the heck? Well, in ES 2015, we got a new loop, the for of loop, that works how we expect it to. You can loop over collections finally, natively in the language. And so now, oh wait, that's because I didn't. There we go. So now I have for const user of data. That's a tiny little thing, but it will make your life so much better. The one thing I will tell you is that if whoever here does C# development as well, yeah, a good bit of you, you're inevitably going to write for in and throw things. But just remember for of, and your life will be better after you finish throwing the stuff. Okay. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is I wrote this, this template that's up here for each user, each GitHub user. And I put inside of it these keys that I could go and find and call string.replace on to place the information for the user in there for when it gets rendered into the browser. And this is fine, but the biggest problem is it's fragile. What happens if somebody doesn't know that that's my key and they put some info, like maybe I'm getting this string back from the server, and and that's why we would start using stuff like handlebars, right? We'd use a templating engine. Well, in ES 2015, we got a new feature called template literals. And I'm going to do a whole bunch of changes here to use template literals. But here you can see now inside of my for loop, I have these $ things inside this string. But the most important thing that I have are these backticks, okay? Backticks allow you to have template literals, which means I can natively inject directly into a string some value. And you can put whatever JavaScript expression you want, you can put in here. You can do like the ternary operator where you have the question mark and the semicolon, you have two different options. You can call functions. You can do all kinds of crazy stuff in here. I'll show you in a bit how you can even use promises in there if you wanted to. But this makes life so much easier. You know, and I'm just plus equaling here. But my code went from let's see here. This file originally was 38 lines long, and now it's 34. I saved 4 lines of code. That's huge. Huge. So, all right. But one of the problems I have here is that I'm still doing this for loop, and we're JavaScript developers. We want to be functional, right? So instead of doing a for loop, what should I really be doing on this data here to get a string out for each item in the list? I want to take the item that's in my array, and I want to convert that into this here. There's a function on arrays that we can use to do exactly that. Huh? Yes.
Or .for-each.
.for-each doesn't do the same thing. .for-each just executes stuff, but .map, you return something from the callback that's in .map, and it creates a new array of the things that you returned. And that's cool, but now I just have an array of strings, and I need one string. That's why I'm plus equaling here. So when you want to take something that you've called map on, what do you call to smush it all up? You call reduce, MapReduce. Now, huh? Join works as well, but not for this talk. I got to show you MapReduce. So what I've done here is in a actual single line of code, I say, I get this thing and I call inner HTML on it. Actually here, you can see here where I'm using the # instead of get element by ID. And then I take the data, which is that array that I got from the GitHub API, and I call map on it. And then I just return a string from it, where I'm doing my string interpolation. And then I call reduce here. And yes, .join would probably be a better way to do this, but it doesn't fit the example. So just stay quiet next time. So I call reduce, and what you do with reduce is you create a reducer function, and then you give it an initial value. So you have the previous value that you have created so far, and the current value, which is this value in the array that you're working on, and you take that and you reduce it into a single value. So here I take the previous string, which starts as an empty string and then slowly gets built up, and I'm just adding on to it. Once you start doing code like this, you will look like a wizard to the developers who don't know about MapReduce or Join, because they'll be like, well, I have to use a for loop. And you're like, no, we're JavaScript developers. We don't use for loops. I feel dirty every time I write a for loop nowadays. So yeah, so use MapReduce and be one of the cool kids. Okay, so we've got that. But I'm still here. I'm calling this get JSON, and then I'm .thenning off of it. And for those of you who are C# developers, asynchronous code is way easier to write in C# because of 2 keywords. What are they? You're whispering it. Just say it out loud. Async and await. Yes. Well, here's the cool thing. JavaScript promises, they took those, and they built on top of those the async and await keywords. They also use generators, but we're not going to talk about those. So we can switch this from being .then style code to being, it looks synchronous just by switching over to using async and await. So So now, wait, that didn't do it. What the heck? Here we go. Apparently I didn't do it in users. So I can say const response equals await fetch, and then I return response.json. Okay. Now I'm still, you'll notice here I have the async keyword, which tells the JavaScript engine that I'm allowed, or that this is going to return a promise. And so it needs to do its thing with this to make the syntactic sugar work. And then outside of here, when I call it, since for whatever reason I used a whole lot, but the reason this is all acting goofy is, oh wait, I did do it. How did nobody make fun of me for that? Come on, guys and ladies, you got to make fun of me. So I missed it. Here, I call await and then I do it. That's nice, right? But here's the cool part. I got my Chrome here. I called it. That works. That's native in the browser. I didn't transpile anything. Remember, for those of us who have been doing development using Webpack, and there's always that one person who walks in and says, why can't we just have a script tag that loads up the entire application? Well, you can take them to my GitHub repo and say, shut up, we choose not to. So, okay, so let's see here. So now we're using async and await. We're doing all of this native in the browser. I showed it to you working in Chrome. Here, I will show it to you working in Firefox. Okay. I don't believe this currently works in Edge as the application stands. Oh, it does. That's awesome. Okay. So there we go. Edge, Firefox, Chrome. This is working across all of them. I have a couple more things I want to show you. Now I'm using MapReduce, but I'm going to show you a way friendlier syntax that I personally like way better even than using string.join. So I'm going to switch from using MapReduce. Where did my, oh, there it is. I'm going to switch from using MapReduce to using the rest and spread operators. So now we look here. What I've done now is I've created a property on my class called GenerateHTML that is a function that I can call. Okay, and so down here in activate, I await get JSON, and then I take inner HTML and I just create an empty string. I call concat, and then I take data map, or sorry, the data. I call map on it, which generates this whole. For each item, it generates that template I needed. And that gives me an array, right? Well, these three dots here tell the JavaScript engine, spread that array out. Take that array and rip it apart so that each item in that array becomes a parameter to concat, okay? Because concat, if we look at it here, oh, it was already showing it to me, returns a string that contains the concatenation of two or more strings. And so you could pass in, string 1 variable, string 2 variable. But here, I just take the array and I spread it out. Okay? This is the rest and spread operators are truly amazing, especially when you start using them with promises and everything. You can also, and I'm not going to show this in here, but let's say that let's say that instead of doing this inline here, okay, we'll take that data that I have. Let's say that the first two items in that array I knew that I needed. It had something special, okay? And so I can say first and second equals data, okay? So I need the first and the second items in that array. This line of code will go grab the first item in the array, assign it to first, grab the second item in the array, assign it to second. But now what if the rest of the items in that array I want to put into an item or a variable called everything else? Well, I can use the same operator, but now it's called the rest operator instead of the spread operator, and say everything else. And now I've taken this array of data, and I've got the first item, the second item, and then an array that holds everything else in that. You can also do this with objects now, and that's really cool because you can reach in and grab properties out of objects. You can even reach into a property on an object and then grab a property inside it in levels deep. The syntax is a little goofy, but I use this all the time. In the application I have that I've written at work, we have a bunch of lookups that have to get pulled down from our API, and each of those is a hit to an API call, or out to an HTTP API. And so I use promise.all, which will you can pass in a whole bunch of promises, and it will return an array with the results for each of those promises. So I say await promise.all, and then I have just a whole array that I pass in for each of these lookups. And so what's cool is those all get launched at the same time. And because await is on promise.all and not on each of those individual promises, they all get launched at the same time. And when they're all done returning, then promise.all resolves. And now I've got an array that has the data for each of those items because I've already called .json inside of the wrapper call. And now I have this array, so I use array destructuring, and I know which spot in the array each thing is going to be. And so in a single line of code, I load like 15 different lookups from 15 different API calls. And it's like that because all of those API calls get launched at the exact same time. We're running on HTTP 2, so they're all pipelined. They all come. It's amazing. I highly recommend it. Okay. So that is the spread operator using map and reduce. I can skip the next step because apparently everything is working in Edge. Although let me quickly test Edge one more time. Yeah, it's still working. Okay. When I started giving this talk last year, it didn't quite work in Edge. There was a element.forEach wasn't a thing. So, okay. So at this point, I now have an application that, as we see here, works in Edge, works in Firefox. Maybe it works in Firefox. Hold on. Let's see here. Yeah, works in Firefox and works in Chrome. But who here only supports the latest browsers? Who here has to support some version of Internet Explorer with your application? Most of us, right? And so you're probably looking at all of this and saying, that's great, Ashley, but I'm never going to get to do any of this fun stuff because I need Webpack and I need Transpilers to, transpile all of my code down so that it works in the oldest version of a browser I support, because I have to run IE 10 or whatever inside of my corporate network. And I get that. And I can't help you get all of the import statements and everything that I've shown you. I can't get all of that to work natively in browsers. But I can take that old jQuery app and I can bring it in, and I can tell new browsers to use the new version of my application and old browsers to just use the old school way. So, and I just added this yesterday, so it's probably not going to work, but we'll find out. So, okay, so what I've done here is I still have my scripts folder that has everything, but I copied in here a folder called Legacy that has my old jQuery-based application, all right? And in here, I've still got everything, and I have this config file, and the only thing I changed in here was changed the base URL from scripts to legacy, okay? And now I went in, and next I went into my index.html file, where, if you remember, we put script type equals module. Well, here's the thing. Internet Explorer 10 has no idea what type equals module means. And this was actually used by, I keep mentioning handlebars, and so they would say script type equals what, handlebars or something, and so the browser would ignore whatever was inside that script element. Well, new browsers know how to run type equals modules, so they run it. Well, after that, you put script no module, and browsers that know how to run modules will ignore those script tags. So here I say script no module, source, load up require.js, and then load up my old application. And now I have an application that runs here in Chrome. And if I pull up my, let's see here, sources, you'll see here that that legacy folder hasn't been loaded, okay? But I have Internet Explorer 10 running here. See, it says modern JavaScript app. I can go in here. IE10's browser is, or its JavaScript engine is kind of slow, and so this doesn't always work for me. But there it goes. It's actually working, okay? And this is running the require.js stuff. And let's see here. Can I make this zoom in? Here we go. So if you notice here, it's loading the legacy stuff. And you'll also notice that it tried to load scripts app, and it, for whatever reason, it's trying to load that script type equals module, and it doesn't know what to do with that. But I have no errors here. IE10 doesn't know how to read an import statement. See, this works in IE10. Who thought that you could do that? Okay. So the thing I want you to get out of what I'm showing here in this last step isn't necessarily that I'm going to go back and I'm going to drop Webpack, okay? The thing I want you to get out of this is let's create two builds of our application. One for the legacy browsers, where you transpile everything back into ES5 code that works all the way back to IE9 or 10 or 11, whatever you support. And then one for your evergreen browsers, where you're not transpiling anything that the browser already knows how to do. And then just tell Webpack to put script no module. And you can still have your Webpack bundle of your new application, of your fancy application where it's natively using async await and everything, while your old browsers still work, okay? So that's I know this talks about JavaScript without transpilers and everything, and I'm finishing this by saying still use transpilers. I understand modern JavaScript we're not going to use just a script tag, but if the only thing you get out of this is that you maybe start looking at creating two builds, because the browsers are only going to get faster at running these new features, whereas Babel or TypeScript, they transpile it, and you're never actually getting to take advantage of these features. If you do that, I feel like I've won with this talk. So anyways, I have gone 3 minutes over, and I'm sorry about that, but thank you very much. And if you have any questions, go ahead.